Hi, Rose here. So far, we've learned about who Joseph Rutherford was, how he didn't immediately start following Russell when he received his copies of Studies in the Scriptures, and it wasn't until 12 years later, when he became the Watchtower's legal advisor, that he got baptized. And then it was shortly after that that he then became Russell's personal attorney. We learned how he defended Russell as Charles Russell refused to pay his wife's support payments. We saw how Rutherford supported Russell as Russell denied his wife any support whatsoever. We saw how Rutherford helped Russell skip town and start a new business in New York so that Russell wouldn't be arrested due to his lack of support payments. We also learned who Paul Johnson was and his trip to England. We saw how Johnson felt he was the faithful steward of Matthew 28. So Rutherford went around calling him demented and insane, both in Britain and in the States, even though Rutherford was claiming that role for himself. We learned that even though Joseph Rutherford was married and had a son, he had no problem leaving his sick wife Mary in California so that he could come to New York to take control and run things at the Watchtower headquarters. How Rutherford came to New York to become the faithful slave. We've learned who Alexander Macmillan was and how he called a meeting of the board of directors when he wasn't even on the board. We saw how Macmillan did not even allow the vice president at the time, Alfred Ritchie, to take the lead as chairman during this meeting, and instead insisting that Joseph Rutherford was to take that position. We learned about the sisters in Charles Russell's will, the ones who Charles Russell had stated as trustees in his last will and testament to vote on behalf during and after his death as to who would become the next president, and how Rutherford made sure that these women would not vote against him to become president during the next election process. We saw how Rutherford made sure that Alfred Ritchie's name, the then vice president, was not read as his opponent to become president during the same election. We saw just how Joseph Franklin Rutherford stole the presidency of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society on January 6, 1917. Well, that's how Joseph Rutherford got the presidency, but how did he legally make it stick so that he had full control over everything in both the states and internationally? Well, before I go on, please make sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons to help this video go out to a larger audience, algorithms and all. And I always enjoy reading your comments. Now you need to imagine the tension that was going on at Bethel right after this election. Not only had Macmillan and Rutherford humiliated Ritchie in front of all of the other brothers, they legally did not allow him to act as the vice president of the organization. And then when it came to the names for the presidential election that was to be held on January 6th, they made sure that only Joseph Rutherford's name was read to the brothers and sisters in the audience. And the brothers and sisters didn't even know that they could vote for Brother Ritchie, as they had done for the last 5 years. Well, what did Ritchie do about that? He did not immediately sue brothers Rutherford or Macmillan, because we're not supposed to sue our brothers. And that's where this video starts. In my other videos, I stated that certain names and faces will be very important to remember. So here they are. We have Brother Alfred Ritchie, who had been the vice president of the People's Pulpit in New York from January 11th to January 1917. You have Brother William Van Amberg, who is on the board of directors acting as secretary and treasurer. You have Alexander Macmillan, who actually presents himself as Rutherford's right-hand man. And you have Joseph Rutherford, legal counsel for the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, living in California at the time. Macmillan, who was not on the board and did not hold any position, had told all of the members on the board of directors, besides Van Amberg and Rutherford, that they needed to resign off the board at Charles Russell's funeral. Macmillan then told these men that if they didn't resign, they were going to be kicked off as board members, and that they would also be kicked out of Bethel. But how was Macmillan able to say that to a board member? If anything, he was just a shareholder with no control. What made Macmillan feel so emboldened as to talk to the board members that way? It would be like a Bethel elder or a Bethel helper saying that to a current governing body member today. Macmillan obviously did not have very much respect for any of the brothers on the board. As the annual meeting regional convention came closer, Macmillan would tell Van Amberg that there was only one brother competent and qualified to take charge of this work now, and that was Joseph Rutherford. But once again, this went against Charles Russell's explicit instructions in his last will and testament. In the summer of 1916, Alexander Macmillan had suggested a number of possible helpers from different parts of the country in order to help Russell at Bethel's headquarters. Due to Russell's ongoing health issues. But Russell didn't seem to think that any of these brothers suitable or in a position to come to Brooklyn, and this included Joseph Rutherford, who had been sent out of Bethel in 1915. Rutherford had borrowed $1,000 from Russell to set up a law firm in California. As I stated, Rutherford lived in California with his ill wife, Mary. But apparently Russell did not consider Rutherford a likely candidate to move to New York to live at Bethel and work daily with Brother Russell, as Alfred Ritchie had been doing. Both Macmillan and Rutherford knew this. Now, this is just my personal opinion that I'm going to state right now. See, I think Macmillan and Rutherford were planning this way before Russell's death, because Russell had been ill. How else would Macmillan, who was not on the board of directors, feel as though he could call a meeting of those that ran the organization, and then not even allow the vice president to conduct this meeting? How and why did Macmillan think he would get away with doing something like that? Well, who was the Society's organization's legal representative? Joseph Franklin Rutherford. And remember, the organization is not just a religion. It's also a business. And it's still a business today. It's not the publishing company that it once was. It's more of a real estate holding corporation now. So an editorial committee of 3 was set up. Alfred Ritchie was put on this committee. However, so was Van Amberg and Rutherford. Macmillan was set as the go-between between those 3 and the rest of the board of directors, in case there were any questions to any decisions that those 3 men made. But once Rutherford was legally placed as president, that editorial committee was no longer really needed. You'll see why. So let me ask you a question. After watching these videos so far, what do you think about Rutherford or Van Amberg and Macmillan? What they had done? Once Rutherford was elected as the president, he used that editorial committee that was set up for another purpose other than what it was set up for. He used it for his personal use. After Rutherford became the president, he had Macmillan and the other 2 men on this editorial committee talk to the shareholders about setting up bylaws and resolutions. What these bylaws and resolutions did was give Rutherford, as the president, ultimate authority, taking any control away from the board of directors. In my previous videos, we talked about what happened at the annual election on Saturday, January 6th, 1917, during the regional convention. This is also what happened. Prior to the January 6th annual meeting required by law, Rutherford had met with an outside law firm. Here, they came up with bylaws to add to the legal charter. This charter stated exactly how the business was to be run. But these bylaws, as I said, gave Rutherford full control over the business entity as president. That's how sure Rutherford was that he was going to be elected president. It wasn't until after January 6th, after he was elected president, that Rutherford presented these bylaws to the other board members. Because the annual meeting is where these bylaws had to be actually voted in by the shareholders for them to become legal and binding. At the time, according to the charter, the business had been run by the board of directors. The board of directors were members who were the ones in charge of how the business was ran. Rutherford wanted to make himself in charge, and he knew how to do that legally. Prior to Rutherford becoming Russell's attorney, he had already staged 2 other coups, or attempts, to take something over. The bylaws he wanted to add stated that the president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society would be in full control, not the board of directors. Now, since he already got the vote to become president, he now needed to make sure he kept that presidency and control permanently. This is where you're going to have to picture things again. Most of us have all known very strong, imposing, loud men at one point in our life. I'm talking strong, imposing brothers that have no problem stating their opinions. So imagine that that's happening at this annual meeting that is held every year. There's a dispute going on, and it's happening among the governing body. See, that's what was happening. Rutherford, during the annual meeting, was trying to get the board of directors to sign in these bylaws so that the shareholders in the audience could then vote them in legally. If you've ever been in an elders meeting, they don't always go as smooth as you might think. In fact, at times it can get very heated, and that's exactly what happened here. All of this is happening behind the stage during the annual meeting. The brothers and sisters are out in the audience and they're waiting for this meeting to conclude. Rutherford is getting upset because the brothers don't like the wording in the bylaws he wants added. Once voted in, the bylaws would take precedent over what the current charter said, so they were in deep discussion over it, and Rutherford just wanted them to be added. So what does Rutherford do? He starts raising his voice and cussing. And remember, this is a regional convention. Rutherford is getting more and more upset because the brothers will not sign those damn bylaws. And Rutherford has no problem making a scene in front of all of the brothers and sisters in the audience. And if that's what needs to be done, God damn it, brothers, I have no problem doing it. See what I mean? If you had been one of those present, what would you have done? If you were one of those brothers in the back of the stage talking to another brother, and you were also part of the governing body, what would you have done? Rutherford's making a scene, and the brothers and sisters had been waiting all day. Well, those brothers gave in to make peace for the time being. That's what happened. Rutherford got his bylaws read at the annual meeting during the convention and voted in. The brothers and sisters in the audience didn't know to vote otherwise. And many of them didn't really understand the impact of what they were saying yes to because they hadn't heard and gone over those bylaws prior to that day. So Rutherford got the control he wanted. Paul Johnson would later write, "The brothers tamely submitted and recommended those power-grasping and lording resolutions as bylaws at the shareholders' meeting." But note this. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle on July 31st, 1917 said that there were actually a number of people at that meeting that voted against Joseph Rutherford as president. The entire election at that regional convention put aside the charter requirement regarding nominations of who would become president. Joseph Franklin Rutherford was made president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, actually illegally, but as far as the state of Pennsylvania went, it was legal. There were a lot more things that went on regarding legalities. Basically what happened was that Rutherford tricked the brothers, confusing them on dates and places that needed to happen legally. Remember, it wasn't just the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania. You also had the subsidiary company, the People's Pulpit Association of New York. It too had a charter to follow in order to elect the president, the vice president, etc., as you see here. You have to picture what's going on again. You have a brother that comes in the truth as an attorney, and you trust that brother. If that brother, who is a college-educated attorney, tells you something, would you believe it? Not only that, he now has a letter from an outside law firm that's backing what he says. That's what happened to those first 5 trustees who voted on behalf of Russell's shares. Once he got the position of power, he knew what legalities needed to be taken care of to keep that power and obtain complete control. Then, he kicked anyone that questioned him or his authority out of Bethel. Those that remained were required to sign a statement to the fact that he was in control, and they would follow and not question him. But one brother did question him. The ousted brothers had a meeting with the ecclesia, or the congregations in Pittsburgh, for a business meeting on July 17th. Rutherford there had to explain his actions legally to the congregation, to everyone in the audience, and that included sisters as well as brothers. Well, Rutherford tried, but he failed miserably. Francis H. McGee, who was an assistant to the Attorney General of the state of New Jersey, went over what Rutherford at the annual meeting had done. McGee showed everyone present what Rutherford had illegally done and explained the bylaws that Rutherford had insisted be put in. And Rutherford couldn't deny it, even though he tried. McGee was smart, he was humble, he was methodic, and he was in no rush to explain himself to the brothers and sisters, whereas Rutherford was worried about losing his presidency. 8 o'clock the following day, July 18th, 1917, the brothers met again, but this time at the Bethel home in Brooklyn. Remember Paul Johnson? He was there too. He was going to act as a mediator between Rutherford and the ousted brothers, because Johnson truly wanted peace. The 4 ousted brothers wanted the legal opinion, or the letter that I talked about earlier that Rutherford had obtained from the outside law firm. Well, they wanted their own attorneys to look at the letter. Before the meeting started, Rutherford made a very humble prayer. This prayer prompted Johnson to express appreciation for Rutherford's humility and offered to help him. Well, Johnson later found out that that was a mistake, because as the meeting went on, it became clear that Rutherford was in it for himself. When the mediation efforts of Johnson failed between Rutherford and the ousted brothers, McGee urged those 4 brothers to take Rutherford to court. The brothers seriously considered this, but once again, Ritchie objected. Why? Because we do not take our brothers to court. And not only was Ritchie reminding those ousted brothers, but they were also receiving letters from around the country. So in early August 1917, the ousted brothers decided to drop all legal proceedings against Rutherford, Macmillan, and Van Amberg, because it's not what a Christian does. So I have a question. What would have happened if those ousted brothers legally took Rutherford to court? Would he still have been made president the following year? Remember, in Russell's charter, it is very specific in what it said regarding the board of directors and voting in the president, the vice president, etc., where it was supposed to be held and when it was supposed to be held, who was supposed to be on the editorial committee, and who would take their place should anything happen. Russell even went so far as to state that no brother would be allowed to do anything that would be repugnant against this charter. But wouldn't what Rutherford and Macmillan and Van Amberg did be considered repugnant against Russell's stated wishes? So really, can you consider Rutherford the actual faithful steward that was chosen in 1919? Or was he just an imperfect, not inspired man who was greedy for power? Would you actually consider those ousted brothers who had been on the board of directors, as well as any of the brothers who stood up to Joseph Rutherford, as evil slaves infiltrating the organization that Jehovah needed to cleanse from the organization in order to choose them in 1919, as the organization has claimed happened since Rutherford's day? The 1933 preparation book stated that Jehovah, by his prophet, which would have been Rutherford was claiming himself to also be a prophet here. Were the brothers and sisters supposed to listen to the prophet Rutherford, or would they be sticklers to adhering the words and opinions of a deceased man, Charles Russell, his wishes? So what happened isn't what the organization has always claimed happened, is it? If Joseph Rutherford illegally gained the presidency of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, and then called himself the faithful steward as well as prophet of Jehovah, are any of his teachings really from God, or are they just his opinions? Besides the date, 1914, Rutherford phased out all of Charles Russell's teachings and replaced them with his own. You don't think that's possible? How many generation teachings have we been taught? Can brothers have a beard now? Can sisters wear pants? Do you have to keep track of how much time you go out in service? So, how are Russell's and Rutherford's teachings different? What teachings affect us today? It might really surprise you. Next, we're going to go over the finished mystery. According to Russell's last will and testament, Rutherford wasn't supposed to put out any other periodicals or books published and distributed. So what's the first thing Rutherford does as the newly elected president? He puts a book out. And this book is considered seditious by the United States government. And that's why he ended up in jail. Not because of the Catholic Church or because as God's channel they were cut off for a short time. He was imprisoned on treason. It's because Rutherford didn't check the book as the president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society before it was published. The book had been co-written by a Methodist and Baptist preacher who started to follow Russell. One was known as a pacifist. But what was this book? what happened? How did the first book that Joseph Rutherford, as the faithful steward, put out affect the brothers and sisters of that time? Well, you're going to have to come back to find out. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like. Again, algorithms. And if you really liked it, please subscribe so that you can get notified. As always, thank you for watching. Take care of yourself, everyone. Don't let those men in New York